The slap that should have ended everything. No one remembered the man's name anymore. Not the waiters rushing past him. Not the musicians tuning their instruments. Not even most of the men who had once worn the same uniform he did. He sat alone at the far edge of the room, back straight, hands folded, jacket neatly pressed despite its age. The fabric still carried the faint stiffness of military tailoring, as if it refused to forget what it had once stood for. The war had ended more than a decade earlier. But for him, it never really had. The ballroom of the Atlantic Crest Hotel glowed with polished brass and soft amber light. Cigarette smoke curled lazily toward the chandeliers, blurring the edges of laughter and money. This was the kind of place where deals were sealed with smiles and erased with silence. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration. A charity dinner. A benefit for veterans. A night of music, elegance, and remembrance. That was the word printed on the programs. Remembrance. Yet the veterans sat unremembered. Across the room, a ripple of attention moved like a tide. Heads turned, voices lowered, chairs scraped softly against the marble floor. Dean Martin had arrived. He didn't make an entrance so much as the room made one for him. There was no rush, no performance. Just that familiar ease, the kind that came from a man who knew exactly who he was and had nothing to prove. His tuxedo was perfectly tailored, his smile relaxed but observant. He nodded to a few familiar faces, exchanged a quiet joke with the bandleader, and took in the room with calm eyes. Dean had been invited to sing, to bring warmth, to remind people why they were there. But the moment his gaze reached the far edge of the ballroom, his expression changed, just slightly. He noticed the man sitting alone. Dean always noticed the people no one else did. Before he could move, the room shifted again. This time it wasn't admiration. It was fear. The mob boss entered without announcement, without apology, and without slowing his stride. He was a heavy man, thick through the shoulders, his confidence forged not from talent or service, but from power that had never been challenged. Conversations died mid-sentence. Waiters froze. The band stopped tuning. The mob boss didn't need to raise his voice. His presence did it for him. He walked straight toward the bar, his entourage trailing behind like shadows that had learned to walk. On the way, his elbow struck the veteran's chair. Not hard, but deliberate. The chair scraped loudly. The old man looked up. His eyes were calm, not defiant, not afraid. Just tired. Watch it, the mob boss said, barely glancing at him. The veteran stood slowly. He moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned long ago that sudden movements could cost lives. Apologies, the veteran said evenly. Didn't see you there. A reasonable man would have waved it off. A decent man might have apologized too. But this man wasn't interested in reason or decency. He laughed. Not loudly, not joyfully. Cruelly. You didn't see me, the mob boss said. You blind old man. The room held its breath. The veteran didn't answer right away. He adjusted his jacket instead, smoothing the lapel where a small, faded pin rested, a symbol most of the room had forgotten how to recognize. I've seen enough for one lifetime, the veteran replied quietly. That was when it happened. The slap wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was worse. A flat palm. Sharp. Humiliating. The sound cracked through the ballroom like a gunshot made of skin and shame. The veteran staggered but did not fall. Silence swallowed the room whole. No one moved. No one spoke. Not because they approved, but because they were afraid of what came next. The mob boss sneered, satisfied. Sit down, he said. This is a celebration, don't ruin it. The veteran stood there for a moment longer, jaw tight, eyes steady. Then, slowly, he sat back down. Not in defeat. In dignity. Across the room, Dean Martin had gone very still. He had seen fights before. He had seen threats, insults, power plays. He had grown up around men who believed fear was the same thing as respect. But this was different. This was a man who had survived war being struck in a room built to honor him, while everyone pretended not to see. Dean set his drink down. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't call attention to himself. He simply turned to the bandleader and said something quietly. The bandleader's eyes widened. "You sure?" the man whispered. Dean nodded once. The band resumed, not with the scheduled song, not with something light or forgettable, but with a slow, solemn melody that cut through the smoke and chatter like a blade of memory. Heads turned again. The mob boss frowned. "What's this?" he muttered. Dean stepped onto the stage. No announcement. No applause. Just a man standing under a spotlight that suddenly felt heavier than gold. He didn't sing. Not yet. He looked out at the room, then, deliberately, let his gaze settle on the veteran at the edge of the ballroom. Every eye followed. "Before we continue," Dean said calmly, his voice carrying without effort, "I'd like to ask everyone here to stand." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The mob boss scowled. "Sit down," he hissed to his table. But something about Dean's tone made people rise anyway. Slowly, uneasily. Dean waited until every chair was empty. Then he turned fully toward the veteran. "This evening," Dean said, "was organized to honor service." His eyes never left the old man. To honor sacrifice. A pause. To remember. The word landed differently this time. "There's a gentleman here tonight," Dean continued, "who doesn't need applause, he's earned silence." The room felt suddenly too small. Dean stepped off the stage. He walked, not hurried, not hesitant, across the ballroom. Past the mob boss's table. Past men who controlled money, men who controlled streets, men who controlled fear. None of them stopped him. Dean reached the veteran. He didn't ask permission. He simply extended his hand. The veteran hesitated, then took it. Dean helped him stand. Then, without saying another word, Dean did something no one expected. He saluted. Not casually, not symbolically, but properly. The kind of salute that came from respect, not performance. The room froze. The mob boss stood halfway out of his chair. "You got a problem," he snapped. Dean didn't look at him. Still holding the salute, Dean spoke, quietly but with a steadiness that cut deeper than shouting ever could. "No," Dean said, "but you might." The mob boss laughed harshly. "You forget where you are." Dean finally turned and smiled. "I know exactly where I am," he said, "and so do you." The music stopped. The silence returned, but this time it belonged to someone else. What happened next would never be printed in the papers. It would never be discussed on talk shows. It would never be mentioned in biographies. Because what Dean Martin did after that moment didn't look like defiance. It looked like something far more dangerous. Control. And that was the beginning of why this story was quietly erased from history. The room where power changed hands. The applause never came. That was the first thing Dean Martin noticed. In any other room, in any other night, a gesture like that would have drawn cheers, whistles, some loud declaration of courage. But this room didn't run on applause. It ran on calculation. People stayed standing, unsure whether they were witnessing a tribute or the beginning of something dangerous. Dean lowered his salute and gently guided the veteran back into his chair. He leaned close, just enough for only the old man to hear. "You don't owe anyone here a thing," Dean said softly. The veteran met his eyes. For the first time since the slap, emotion flickered, anger held back by discipline, pride tempered by years of loss. "Neither do you," the veteran replied. Dean smiled faintly. "Maybe, but some debts are inherited." Across the room, the mob boss pushed his chair back with deliberate force. The sound echoed louder than it should have. "Real touching," he said, clapping once, slow and sarcastic. "But you're done now. Get back on stage, sing your song." Dean turned, not sharply, not aggressively, but fully. The kind of turn that signals a decision has already been made. "I will," Dean said evenly, "just not the one you're expecting." A few nervous laughs escaped the crowd. No one else joined in. The mob boss stepped closer. His men followed, forming a loose semicircle that quietly boxed Dean in. Not threatening yet, just reminding everyone who controlled the space between courage and consequence. "You like heroes," the mob boss said. "So do I, especially quiet ones." Dean nodded once. "Then you should try being one." The air tightened. People began to understand something was unfolding that couldn't be smoothed over with jokes or money. This wasn't about embarrassment anymore. It was about dominance and who would be allowed to keep theirs. Dean gestured toward a side door. "Let's not ruin the evening for everyone else." The mob boss studied him for a long moment, then smirked. "After you." The side room was smaller, darker. No band, no audience. Just heavy curtains, polished wood, and the kind of silence where words mattered more than fists. Two of the mob boss's men lingered near the door. Dean closed it himself. He didn't sit. Neither did the mob boss. "You embarrassed me," the mob boss said flatly. Dean shrugged lightly. "You embarrassed yourself." A flash of anger crossed the man's face, but he reined it in. He was used to fear, used to men backing down when they realized who they were speaking to. Dean didn't back down. "Here's how this works," the mob boss continued. "You go back out there, you sing, you pretend none of this happened, and that old man leaves quietly." Dean shook his head. "That won't be happening." The mob boss's smile vanished. "You're confusing fame with power." Dean stepped closer, close enough now that only honesty could survive between them. "No," Dean said, "I'm separating power from fear." For a moment, the room felt like it might tip into violence. Then Dean did something unexpected. He reached into his jacket pocket. One of the mob boss's men shifted instinctively. Dean pulled out a folded piece of paper and placed it gently on the table between them. The mob boss frowned. "What's this?" "Names," Dean replied. "Dates, places." The man didn't touch it. "You threatening me?" Dean's voice softened, but somehow grew heavier. "No, I'm reminding you." The mob boss unfolded the paper slowly. His eyes moved across the page, line by line. The color drained from his face, not completely, but enough. "These are things that never happened," he said. Dean nodded. "That's right, and they'll stay that way if tonight ends correctly." Silence. "Not the empty kind. The loaded kind." "You think you can protect everyone," the mob boss said quietly. "That veteran, the people who stood up because you told them to." Dean met his gaze without blinking. "No," he said, "just the ones worth protecting." The mob boss laughed once, short, humorless. "You don't win by standing still," he said. Dean smiled. "I don't need to win, I just need to not lose myself." The mob boss folded the paper back up and slid it into his pocket. He stepped back, reassessing. "You're a dangerous man," he said. "Not because you're brave, because you make people remember who they were." Dean didn't deny it. They returned to the ballroom separately. The mood had shifted. People sensed it the way animals sense whether something had changed and it wasn't safe to pretend otherwise. Dean went back on stage. He didn't address the incident. He didn't explain. He simply sang. Not a love song. Not a crowd pleaser. A song about coming home. About men who left as boys and returned as ghosts. The veteran closed his eyes. Across the room, the mob boss sat very still. When the song ended, Dean received a standing ovation. Not loud, not wild, but unanimous. The mob boss stood too. He walked to the veteran's table. For a heartbeat, everyone thought it might happen again. Instead, the mob boss placed a hand on the table. "Enjoy the evening," he said curtly and walked out. The doors closed behind him. Only later would people realize what that meant. That he had chosen retreat. That he had been given one. And that Dean Martin had just made an enemy who never forgot, but also never crossed that line again. Because some lines, once drawn in public, cannot be erased. Only avoided. And the veteran. When the night ended, Dean personally walked him to the door. No cameras. No witnesses. Just two men standing under a streetlight. "Thank you," the veteran said. Dean shook his head. "You already paid." What Dean didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that this choice would follow him for years. In canceled bookings, in whispered warnings, in doors that quietly stopped opening. History would forget the room, forget the paper, forget the threat, but it would never forget the shift, because power had been challenged without a punch. And that scared people far more than violence ever could, the silence that followed him. The punishment didn't come loudly. There were no threats carved into doors, no warnings delivered through broken glass, no confrontations in dark alleys. That would have been easier. Instead, the punishment arrived as absence. Dean Martin noticed it first in small ways, the kind people talk themselves out of noticing. A radio appearance quietly rescheduled. A nightclub suddenly renovating. A sponsor who praised him publicly but never returned calls. At first, Dean laughed it off. People get busy, he told himself. But time has a way of revealing patterns, and patterns once seen can't be unseen. By spring, the pattern was unmistakable. The phone rang less. The invitations thinned. The rooms that once felt warm grew polite and cold. Dean's manager tried to spin it. Tastes are changing, he said. That's all, new faces, new sounds. Dean listened, he nodded, but he didn't believe a word of it. Because talent doesn't disappear overnight. And respect doesn't either, unless someone is quietly reminding people that it's safer to look away. The night that confirmed everything came in Chicago. Dean arrived at a venue that had been booked for months, posters already hung, tickets already sold, the place buzzed with anticipation. Then 10 minutes before soundcheck, the owner pulled him aside. Sweaty palms, avoiding eye contact. "I'm sorry," the man said, "we can't do tonight." Dean blinked once. "Why?" The owner swallowed. "I was advised it's not a good time." Advised by who? A pause too long to be innocent. Dean exhaled slowly. "You're canceling." The owner nodded, for everyone's sake. Dean looked past him, to the empty stage, the waiting band, the seats filling with people who had come to forget their troubles for a few hours. "For whose sake?" Dean asked. The owner didn't answer. Dean turned away. He didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He didn't make a scene. That was the part people didn't understand about him. Dean Martin didn't fight noise with noise. He fought it with gravity. That night, instead of performing, Dean walked out the back door. He didn't speak to the press. He didn't issue a statement. But the story spread anyway, quietly like everything else. He's difficult. He crossed the wrong people. He thinks he's bigger than the room. Dean heard it all. And then something else began to happen. People started avoiding him. Not out of dislike. Out of fear. Musicians declined to tour with him. Producers delayed meetings indefinitely. Friends smiled but never lingered. It was isolation without exile. The most effective kind. One evening, weeks later, Dean found himself sitting alone in his living room, the radio low, a glass untouched in his hand. He stared at the wall longer than he meant to. For the first time since that night at the Atlantic Crest, doubt crept in. Not regret. Doubt. Had he done the right thing? The question surprised him, because deep down he already knew the answer. Still, the cost was rising. Then the letter arrived. No return address. Plain envelope. Typed. Dean opened it slowly. "You made us remember something we'd all agreed to forget." That kind of memory makes powerful men nervous. Dean folded the letter once and set it aside. No signature. No threat. Just truth. A week later, he received a call from an unexpected place. A small veterans hall on the edge of town. Old building, fading sign, no money. They wanted Dean to sing. No fee. No publicity. Just a room full of men who'd served, and a few who still remembered. His manager protested. "There's nothing in it for you," he said. Dean smiled faintly. "That's why I'm going." The hall was packed, not with celebrities, not with executives, but with stories. Men in worn jackets, women holding folded photographs, quiet applause, honest eyes. Dean walked on stage without introduction. He sang like he always had, but something was different. There was no performance left in him that night. Only purpose. After the show, as people filed out slowly, Dean saw a familiar figure near the back. The veteran. The same man. Standing straighter now, stronger somehow. Dean crossed the room. "You shouldn't be here alone," Dean said gently. The veteran smiled. "Neither should you." They sat together for a while, no rush, no audience. "You know," the veteran said finally, "they erased plenty of us after the war too." Dean nodded. "I know. But erasing doesn't mean gone," the veteran continued. "It just means hidden." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded program from the night at the Atlantic crest. Creased, saved. "I wasn't invisible that night," he said. "Not to everyone." Dean felt something tighten in his chest. "You stood up," the veteran said. "That doesn't disappear, it travels." Dean looked around the hall, at the people sweeping floors, stacking chairs, thanking him quietly. He understood then. The punishment wasn't the end of the story. It was the test. Because real influence doesn't announce itself. It survives. What Dean didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that the silence around him was about to break. Not with applause, but with consequence. Because the same people who feared him now were starting to fear something else even more. A man who had nothing left to lose. And still chose restraint, what history couldn't erase. The break didn't come like redemption stories promised. There was no dramatic call. No apology wrapped in flowers. No public reversal. It came the way truth often does, sideways. Dean first felt it on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, months after the Veterans Hall concert. He was sitting in a quiet cafe, the kind that didn't care who you were as long as you paid and didn't lie to yourself. A young man approached his table. Not a fan. Not nervous. Not starstruck. Respectful. "My father asked me to thank you," the man said. Dean looked up. "For what?" The man hesitated, then reached into his coat and placed a photograph on the table. It was old, faded, creased at the corners. A group of soldiers, mud on their boots, exhaustion in their eyes, and there, standing just behind the center, was the veteran. He never talked much, the man said, but after that night he started again. Dean studied the photo for a long moment. He said someone reminded him he wasn't finished, the man continued. That mattered. The young man left without waiting for a response. Dean folded the photo carefully and slipped it into his pocket. That evening the phone rang. Not loudly, not urgently, but steadily. A producer, one who hadn't returned calls in over a year. "Dean," the man said cautiously, "I've got a project, small, quiet, no headlines." Dean smiled to himself. What changed? A pause. "People," the producer said, "they're asking different questions now." Dean didn't commit. He didn't need to. Because by then, he understood something important. The silence around him wasn't empty anymore. It was listening. Behind closed doors, whispers had begun circulating, not about Dean's talent, but about his line. The one he would cross. The one he wouldn't erase. The one that had cost him everything except himself. And that made powerful men uneasy. The mob boss heard it too. Not directly. Never directly. But power doesn't need invitations to learn when its grip is loosening. One night, long after the Atlantic crest had changed owners and chandeliers, the mob boss sat alone in his office. The city below glittered like a promise no longer meant for him. A lieutenant stood nearby, shifting uncomfortably. "They're talking," the man said. "About what?" the mob boss asked, not looking up. "About that night, about you leaving." The mob boss's jaw tightened. "They're saying you hesitated." Silence stretched. "They're saying you met someone you couldn't push." The mob boss finally looked up. "What else?" he asked. The lieutenant swallowed. "They're saying it wasn't the veteran who scared you." The mob boss dismissed him with a wave. Alone again, he reached into a drawer and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Names, dates, places, still there, still real. He had won most of his battles by making people forget who they were. But that night, someone had remembered, and memory was dangerous. Meanwhile, Dean continued quietly. No speeches, no crusades, no public reckoning. He sang where he was welcome. He showed up where he was needed. He stayed small enough to stay free. Years passed. The veteran passed too, peacefully, surrounded by people who knew his name. At the service, there were no cameras. Just flags, stories, and one familiar voice reading a line from a letter the veteran had written but never sent. If this world is held together by anything, the letter read, it's men who refuse to become smaller when it's easier. Dean stood in the back. Unnoticed. Content. Decades later, historians would argue about Dean Martin's career. They'd talk about music, about films, about charm. They would not talk about the night a room full of powerful people stood because one man refused to sit down in silence. They wouldn't mention the veteran, or the paper, or the quiet retreat, because some stories don't survive ink. They survive people. And somewhere, long after the applause faded, a young singer would hear about a man who lost opportunities because he kept his dignity. A veteran would tell his grandchild about the night he wasn't invisible. And power, once challenged without violence, would remember that fear is not the same as respect. History erased the moment, but it couldn't erase the effect. Because what Dean Martin did next didn't change the world. It changed who felt allowed to stand in it. And that was enough.